My name is Eleanor Ruth Calloway. I was born Eleanor Ruth Mason on the 6th day of September 1843 in a small farming settlement outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I am 82 years old as I speak these words, and in all those 82 years there is one night I have never been able to leave behind. One night that divided my entire life into two halves, the half before and the half after. I want to tell you about that night. I want to tell you about the family I lost. I want to tell you about the fire that took everything from me in the space of 2 hours, and about the 80 years I have spent living in the shadow of those 2 hours. But first, let me tell you about who they were, because they deserve to be remembered as people, not just as victims, not just as names on a headstone. They were my family, and they were the whole world to me, and I will not let them be forgotten. My father was Robert James Mason. He was born in 1811 in Chester County, Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with large rough hands that could gentle a frightened horse, or lift a sick child with equal tenderness. He had red hair when he was young, though by the time I was old enough to remember it clearly, it had faded to a reddish grey. He laughed easily and loudly, which embarrassed my mother in public, but which I loved with my whole heart. He smelled of wood smoke and leather, and the particular earthy smell of a man who works the land. My father was not a perfect man. He was stubborn past all reason. He held grudges longer than he should have. He had a temper that flared quick and hot, though it never turned to cruelty. But he was a good man, a hard-working man, a man who loved his family fiercely and provided for us without complaint through difficult years and easy ones alike. My mother was Catherine Ann Mason, born Catherine Ann Briggs in 1815. She was small and dark-haired, quick-moving, efficient, with a mind sharp as a tack and a tongue to match when she felt it necessary. She was the kind of woman who could manage a household, tend a sick child, preserve 40 jars of vegetables, and still have supper on the table by 6 o'clock. She was not demonstrative. She rarely said, "I love you," in so many words. But her love was in everything she did. In the extra blanket she laid over you when you were cold, in the way she stayed up through the night when you were feverish, in the careful way she mended your clothes so neatly the tear was invisible. I understood later in life, when I had my own household, how much she had done, how much she had managed, how much she had sacrificed, how little she had asked for herself. I wish I had understood it while she was alive. I wish I had told her more often that I saw her, that I was grateful. My brother Thomas was born in 1838, 5 years before me. He was the eldest child, the one our father was grooming to take over the farm one day. Thomas was serious, where our father was jovial, methodical, where our father was instinctive. He had our mother's dark hair and our father's broad shoulders, and he carried himself with a quiet authority that made people twice his age listen when he spoke. He was 25 years old when he died. He'd been engaged to marry a girl named Clara Whitfield from the next farm. They'd planned the wedding for the spring of 1864. My sister Abigail was born in 1840, 3 years before me, 2 years after Thomas. She was the beautiful one, and she knew it, which should have been annoying, but somehow wasn't, because Abigail wore her beauty lightly, without vanity, as if it was simply a feature, like height or hair color, not something to make a fuss about. She had golden hair, the only one in the family, and our father's green eyes. She laughed constantly, at everything, at nothing, at herself most of all. The house was quieter when she left a room, not because she was loud, but because her presence generated a kind of warmth that you only noticed when it was gone. My youngest brother, William, was born in 1847, 4 years after me. He was 9 years old the night of the fire. He was at that particular age where boys are simultaneously infuriating and irresistible. Always dirty, always hungry, always into something he shouldn't be, but with a gap-toothed grin that made it impossible to stay angry at him. He used to bring me wild flowers he'd picked from the fields, present them to me with enormous solemnity, and then run away before I could embarrass him with gratitude. I kept them pressed in my Bible, those wild flowers. I kept them until they crumbled to dust. And then there was baby Rose, born in 1851, 8 years younger than me. She was 2 years old the night of the fire. She had red hair like our father's, bright copper curls that our mother was endlessly brushing, and she had just recently learned to say all of our names: Thomas, Abigail, Ellie, that was me, Willie, Mama, Papa. She said them like a list of treasures, like she was counting her blessings out loud. My father, my mother, Thomas, Abigail, William, Rose. 6 people, my entire world, gone in one night. The autumn of 1863 had been a difficult one. The war, the Civil War, which had been grinding on for 2 years by then, had reached into our community the way it reached into every community in Pennsylvania. 3 young men from our settlement had already died at Gettysburg that summer. My father was too old to serve. Thomas had been rejected for poor eyesight, and little William was too young. But the war's shadow was everywhere, in the shortages, in the anxious conversations after church, in the empty chairs at neighbors' tables. Despite that shadow, the autumn felt ordinary in the way that ordinary things always feel, like they will last forever. The harvest had been good. My father was pleased with the corn yield. My mother had put up more preserves than usual, filling the cellar shelves with jars of tomatoes and green beans and peaches and apple butter. Thomas was saving money for the wedding. Abigail had been teaching the younger children letters and numbers in the evenings. William had learned to whistle and was doing it constantly, driving us all to distraction. November came cold and early. By the 3rd week of November, we were already banking the fires at night and piling extra quilts on the beds. The farmhouse was old, built by my grandfather in 1820, wooden construction, with a large central fireplace in the main room and a smaller one in the kitchen. It had stood for 40 years without incident. We never thought about fire. Why would we? It had always been there, solid and reliable, keeping us warm through Pennsylvania winters. We trusted it the way you trust the ground under your feet. The night of November 23, 1863, was a Monday. I remember that because I had spent that day doing the weekly washing, and my hands were raw and red from the washboard and the cold water. I remember complaining about my hands at supper, and my mother silently getting up and bringing me a small jar of the goose grease she used for exactly that purpose. She rubbed it into my hands without a word, and I said, "Thank you, Mama," and she patted my hand once and went back to her seat. That was the last time my mother touched me. Supper was salt pork and boiled potatoes and cornbread, the same supper we had most Monday nights. William ate 3 pieces of cornbread and was told by my father that he'd eaten enough. William pointed out that Thomas had eaten 4 pieces, and Thomas said, "I'm a grown man doing a grown man's work." And William said, "I work too," and we all laughed, including William. Rose was sitting in her high chair, methodically destroying her cornbread rather than eating it, and Abigail was trying to convince her that eating it was more satisfying than crumbling it, and failing entirely. After supper, we gathered in the main room as we always did. My father read from the Bible. He read every evening after supper, a chapter or 2, while the rest of us sewed or carved or simply listened. That evening he read from Psalms. I don't remember which psalm, only the sound of his voice reading it, steady and unhurried in the lamplight. By 9 o'clock, the younger children were in bed. William and Rose shared a room at the back of the house. Abigail slept in the room next to theirs. Thomas had the front room. I slept in a small room off the kitchen, which had been added to the house after I was born, and was barely large enough for a bed and a small chest of drawers. My parents slept in the main bedroom at the center of the house. I fell asleep quickly that night. I remember being tired from the washing and my hands still aching despite the goose grease. I remember pulling the quilt up around my shoulders and listening to the wind outside, which had picked up considerably after supper, rattling the windows and whistling under the door. I woke up because I couldn't breathe. There was no dramatic awakening, no explosion, no crack of timber. I simply woke up and realized I was choking, that the air was wrong, that something was terribly wrong. The room was dark, darker than it should have been, and then I realized it wasn't dark. It was full of smoke. Black, thick, choking smoke that had filled my room while I slept. I rolled out of bed and hit the floor. Somewhere in the back of my mind was the memory of something my father had told us years earlier, that smoke rises, that if there's a fire, you get low and stay low. I crawled to my door and reached up to touch the handle, and it was warm but not burning, and I opened it. The kitchen was on fire. The entire back wall of the kitchen was a sheet of orange flame, roaring and crackling with a sound I had never heard before and have never forgotten. A deep, hungry, consuming sound, like something alive and enormous was eating our house. The wooden shelves my father had built along that wall were burning. The dried herbs my mother had hung from the ceiling beams were burning. The curtains were burning. The floor nearest the back wall was burning. I screamed. I screamed my father's name, my mother's name, Thomas, Abigail, Willie, Rose. I screamed until my throat tore. I couldn't go through the kitchen. The fire was already between me and the back of the house where William and Rose slept. I ran to the front of the house instead, to the main room, shouting for everyone. My father appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, then my mother behind him, her hair down, both of them disoriented with sleep. "Fire!" I screamed. "The kitchen! The whole back wall!" My father moved instantly, that instinctive authority taking over. "Catherine, take Eleanor. Get outside." "Thomas!" he bellowed. "Thomas!" Thomas appeared from his room, took in the situation in one look. "William and Rose are in the back," he said. "I know," my father said. "Go." My mother grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front door. I resisted. "William and Rose." "Your father and Thomas will get them," my mother said, and her voice was completely steady, completely controlled, and I believed her because she was my mother and she knew things. She pulled me outside into the cold November night. We stood in the yard, my mother and I, watching the back of the house burn. The wind was feeding it, driving the flames forward through the building. Even as we stood there, we could see the fire spreading, up through the roof, outward along the walls, consuming everything it touched with terrible appetite. My father came out through the front door. He was coughing, bent double, and he was alone. "Thomas is getting them," he said between coughs. "Abigail's room, the window." He turned back to the house. "Robert," my mother said sharply. "Robert, don't." But he was already going back in. I stood in that yard for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. My mother stood beside me, completely still, completely silent, her hand finding mine in the dark and gripping it with a strength that left bruises I didn't notice until days later. We watched the fire eat our house. We watched the roof begin to collapse in sections, sparks shooting up into the black sky like terrible stars. Abigail never came out of the window. Thomas never came back through the front door. My father never came back. William and Rose never came out at all. Neighbors arrived. I don't know when. At some point people were there, men with buckets, women pulling at my mother and me, voices shouting, the hiss of water meeting fire and doing nothing. By the time anyone arrived, it was already too late. The house was fully engulfed, a roaring column of fire visible for miles in the dark Pennsylvania countryside. I was 20 years old. I stood in a neighbor's coat that someone had thrown over my shoulders, in my nightgown with bare feet on frozen ground, and I watched my family's house burn to the ground. My mother stood beside me until the walls fell. Then she sat down on the ground, right there in the yard, and she didn't get up for a long time. They found them in the rubble the next morning when the fire had burned itself out. My father, near the back hallway, just feet from William and Rose's room. Thomas, in the front hallway, where the roof had collapsed on him. Abigail in her room. They said she likely died from the smoke before the flames reached her, which was the only comfort anyone could offer, and which offered very little. William and Rose, my 9-year-old brother and my 2-year-old sister. They were found together in the corner of their room farthest from the door. William must have gathered Rose when he woke up, must have held her, must have tried to protect her. They were found with his arms still around her. My 9-year-old brother trying to shield his baby sister from a fire he couldn't fight. 6 people: my father, my mother, Thomas, Abigail, William, Rose. Only my mother survived. Only her and me, standing in the yard, the only 2 left. My mother died 11 days later. She never recovered from the smoke she'd inhaled that night. Her lungs deteriorated. She developed a fever. And on the 4th of December, 1863, Catherine Ann Mason died in a neighbour's bed, 11 days after the fire. She said almost nothing in those 11 days. She lay in bed and breathed with increasing difficulty, and sometimes looked at me with an expression that contained everything: grief, love, apology, farewell, and said nothing. The last thing she said to me, on the morning of the day she died, was my name. Eleanor. Just that, my name, said as if it meant everything she'd never managed to say aloud. Then she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. I was 20 years old, the sole survivor of a family of 7, standing in a neighbour's house with nothing, no home, no possessions, no money, nothing but the nightgown I'd been wearing when I ran from the fire, and whatever small items neighbours had donated out of charity. I will not pretend that what followed was graceful. It was not. Grief at 20, grief of that magnitude, grief that takes everyone at once. It does something to a person that cannot fully be undone. I did not eat for the first week after my mother died. Not deliberately, not as a choice, but simply because I forgot. The body needs to be reminded to eat when the mind is somewhere else entirely. The neighbour woman, Mrs. Hawkins, would bring me a plate and set it in front of me, and come back an hour later to find it untouched. And she would sit with me and make me take a few bites, and then she would take the plate away. I did not cry. I know that seems strange, but I could not. There was something blocked inside me, something that needed to come out but couldn't find the way. I sat and stared. I slept too much, and then not at all. I walked out to the ruins of the house once and stood among the charred timbers and the ash, and I tried to feel something specific, grief, anger, something with a name, and I felt only a vast, shapeless emptiness that had no name and no edges and no end. The community was kind. People fed me, housed me, gave me clothing. The church took up a collection. I was offered a position as a seamstress's helper in Harrisburg, which I took because I had no other options, and I moved there in February of 1864, 3 months after the fire. I worked. I got through days. I put one foot in front of the other, because that is what you do when you have no other choices. Not because you want to, not because anything feels worth it, but because the alternative is simply lying down and refusing to move. And some stubborn part of me, some part that sounded like my father's voice, like my mother's steady hands, refused to allow that. I met my husband, George Calloway, in 1866. He was a quiet man, a carpenter, gentle and patient. He never asked me to be other than I was, never demanded that I heal faster than I healed, never complained about the nights when I woke up screaming from dreams of fire and could not be easily consoled. He simply stayed. He held my hand. He rebuilt things. We married in 1867. We had 4 children: Robert, named for my father; Catherine, named for my mother; Thomas, named for my brother, and little Abigail, named for my sister. I could not name my children for William and Rose. It was too much. I hope they understand. George died in 1901. We had 34 good years together. I have been a widow for 24 years. There are things I have thought about every day for 60 years. Questions that have no answers, but that won't stop being asked. I have thought about what started the fire. We never knew with certainty. The investigators, such as they were in those days, believed it started in the kitchen, most likely from a spark from the fireplace landing on something flammable. The wind that night was severe, and it could have blown a spark from the fireplace to the wooden wall, or to the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, or to the curtains. In minutes, in that dry November kitchen, it would have been fully involved. An accident, that is what they said. A terrible, ordinary accident of the kind that killed families every winter across Pennsylvania. A spark, a draft, dry wood. A moment of ordinary household life that turned catastrophic. I have thought about what might have been different. If I had slept in a different room, I would have been deeper in the house, and I might not have woken in time. If the wind had been blowing from the other direction, the fire might have spread differently, given them more time. If Thomas had reached William and Rose's room faster, if my father had come back out instead of going in. If. I have thought about William holding Rose in that corner. I have thought about it nearly every day for 60 years. He was 9 years old. He was frightened, and he was brave, and he held his baby sister, and he did not leave her, and they died together. I cannot decide if that is the most heartbreaking thing I know, or the most beautiful. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the most heartbreaking things and the most beautiful things are sometimes the same thing. I have thought about what my father was trying to reach when they found him. He was so close to their room. A few more feet, they said. Just a few more feet, and he might have reached them. I used to torture myself with those few feet. Now I think of it differently. He was trying. Until the very last moment, he was trying to save his children. That is who my father was. That is who he will always be to me. I have thought about Abigail's laugh. I have heard it in my mind almost every day for 60 years. That easy, warm, constant laugh that made any room brighter. I have thought about Thomas's quiet authority, about how he would have been such a good farmer, such a good husband to Clara Whitfield, who mourned him for years before finally marrying someone else. I have thought about my mother's hands, how capable they were, how much they accomplished, how they looked when she pressed goose grease into my raw hands that last evening at supper. I have thought about Rose counting our names. Thomas, Abigail, Ellie, Willie, Mama, Papa. 6 names, her whole world, just like mine. People have asked me over the years how I survived it, how I kept living after something like that. They want me to give them something useful, some wisdom they can take away and keep for dark days. They want me to say that faith sustained me, or that love sustained me, or that time heals all wounds. I cannot say any of those things with complete honesty. What I can say is this: I survived because my body kept going, even when I would have preferred it didn't. I survived because a neighbor woman made me eat when I forgot. I survived because a quiet carpenter named George Calloway stayed beside me through nightmares and silence and grief that came in waves for decades. I survived because I named my children after the ones I lost, and in watching those children grow, I saw pieces of the people I'd lost continuing in the world. I survived because William held Rose in that corner, and I could not dishonor that bravery by giving up. There is something I want to say about fire, about what it takes and what it leaves. Fire took everything material, our house, our furniture, my mother's preserves lining the cellar shelves, my father's Bible, my sister's golden hair and her constant laugh, and the wedding she never got to have. It took bodies, faces, voices, presences. But fire cannot take memory. It tried. In the early years, grief is so overwhelming that memory blurs, details fade, faces become less sharp. I was terrified that I would forget them, that I would wake up one morning and not be able to remember the exact sound of my father's laugh, or the particular way my mother moved through a kitchen, efficient and purposeful. But I did not forget. 80 years old, and I still know every detail of my family's faces. Still know my father's voice reading psalms in the lamplight. Still know the weight of Rose in my arms, the smell of her copper hair, the solemnity with which William presented me with wildflowers he'd picked from the fields. They are still here, in my memory, in the names I gave my children, in the stories I have told until they are worn smooth as river stones. My name is Eleanor Ruth Calloway. I was born Eleanor Ruth Mason in 1843. I am the last of my family. For 60 years I have been the last one, the keeper of the names, the one who remembers. Robert James Mason, Catherine Ann Mason, Thomas Robert Mason, Abigail Grace Mason, William Henry Mason, Rose Catherine Mason. I say their names out loud whenever I can, because as long as someone says them, they are not entirely gone. I will be joining them soon. I am not afraid of that. I have been walking toward that reunion for 60 years. I only hope they recognize me when I arrive.